Okay. Again, class, good afternoon or good day, and welcome back to DRRR. For today, we'll be talking about the continuation of our lecture in fire hazards. We're continuing our lecture on fire protection. To understand fire protection, we must first understand what we call as the Fire Code of the Philippines in 2008. Right? I've mentioned this before in our meeting, RA 9514. But for today, we'll be focusing on Section 7D. On Section 7D, we can see the different uh, provisions of the law that manufacturers and owners of infrastructure need to follow in terms of developing anything or any object that we can use in fire protection. Okay, so for fire protection, we need to do the following. The first one is for the manufacturers and owners of infrastructure to have a sprinkler system. A sprinkler system is a system that is designed that if it detects heat, it releases water in the ceiling. I'm sure that you've known this in movies that you've watched before, or even some news articles that you've watched. Hose boxes, hose reels, and standpipes. We can actually see these in different malls, right? Especially in SM. You would see a box that contains a hose, an axe, and the source of water. And that box is actually mandated by law to be required, especially in commercial buildings. Okay? A fire alarm system, a system in which people will know if there is a fire. May it be automated or may it be through manual activation. A firewall. A firewall is a wall that separates buildings or even rooms or warehouses or storage areas from each other. This firewall is specially designed to resist the heat from a fire in order to reduce a fire or to reduce the chances of a fire going from one building to another. Provisions for confining the fire at its source, such as fire resistive floors and walls, which is why commercial buildings often have buildings made up of heavy materials, not light materials such as wood, because these heavy materials resist fire more efficiently as compared to light materials. The termination of all exits when there is a fire, a stairway, vertical shaft, horizontal exit, or any means to egress sealed from smoke and heat. Any way or any means that we can escape from smoke and heat when there is a fire inside a building. A fire exit plan or on each floor showing the route we will take when there is a fire emergency. A self-closing fire-resistive doors that will automatically close when there is a fire. Fire dampers. Fire dampers can be centralized air that actually releases the smoke when there is a fire emergency inside the commercial building. That release of smoke is through our roof vents. And lastly, properly marked and lighted exits with provisions for emergency lights to illuminate exit ways in cases of power failures. Which is why when we watch in a cinema, even if you're very annoyed of that exit sign on the side of the movie, that is still required by law to be open. That those are fire exits. Okay? And they cannot turn off the light of that fire exit as provided in this Republic Act. In Republic Act 9514, this needs to be lighted up and needs to be clear when it comes to its direction to serve its purpose as fire protection. Now, as mentioned earlier, we know of the elements of a fire. We know of the fire tetrahedron. The fire tetrahedron is made up of heat, oxygen, fuel, and the chain reaction. Now, because we understand these elements of the fire tetrahedron, we can develop our own theory on how to extinguish a fire, also known as fire extinguishment theory, wherein each of these elements have their corresponding extinguishment pattern. For example, in order for the fire to be extinguished, one of these elements must be reduced. To reduce heat, we can use a method of cooling. To reduce fuel, we can use starvation by removing the fuel itself. To reduce oxygen, we can use a method called a smothering. These methods are called as the fire extinguishment theory, including inhibition of the continuous chain reaction. As mentioned earlier, fire burns because it has a continuous chain reaction of combustion where it takes up fuel, oxygen, and releases heat in order for it to perform the combustion reaction in chemistry, as we understand, right? And in order to do this, in order to perform cooling, perform starvation, perform inhibition, perform smothering, we must make use of the basic firefighting tools. A fire extinguisher, for example, contains compressed air, compressed gases, compressed water that allows it to extinguish a fire through various means, which we'll be talking about in detail later. A water supply or a standing water supply is also important in terms of lowering the heat of a fire, right? So lower the heat, there needs to be water or anything that it can be cool that can cool down the fire itself. A fire blanket will do the same, will smother the fire in order for it to lose its oxygen or to have diluted oxygen, and in order for it to have therefore a smaller flame and eventually die out. And lastly, a bucket of sand, which does the same method with a fire blanket. Now, let's talk about each of these steps in the fire extinguishment theory, starting with cooling. Cooling is the method in which we can reduce the temperature. The main goal of the method of cooling is the reduction of heat. How do we do this? We do this by applying a cooling agent. Water is the most common cooling agent. However, we do not use water. Or water and even foam that contains 94% water is not ideal for certain classes of fire, like a Class C fire. A Class C fire is a fire born out of electricity or electrical energy, which is why it's not recommended that we use a cooling agent when it comes to a fire or when it comes to a Class C fire because it contains electricity. What can we do then, sir? Well, we have other specialized equipment when it comes to an electric fire or Class C fire. Next, smothering. Smothering is the exclusion of oxygen. We can do this by putting a blanket or anything that can cover up the flame in order to make a barrier between the fire itself and the environment, because our environment, again, is made up of 21% oxygen. And if we allow that 21% oxygen to be exposed to the fire, then it will just continuously burn, which is why we smother. Okay? Or even the deprivation of oxygen. It's the deprivation of oxygen and the dilution of oxygen. Sir, how do we dilute oxygen in our atmosphere? Well, we spray the fire with carbon dioxide. We can exclude or we can limit the oxygen by using a wet blanket. Diba? This is called as blanketing. Any blanket, just as long as you dip it in water, can be used as a tool in smothering a flame or even throwing sand or soil. The next in fire extinguishment theory is starvation. Starvation is the removal of fuel. If we remove fuel, it is most likely that the fire will extinguish. Okay, may it be, for example, here in a type B fire or Class C fire. Class B fire. A Class B fire is caused by gas leaks or petroleum, right? But when we do starvation, we cut off the supply of the gas or the petroleum by closing off the valve, therefore shutting the fuel supply and causing the fire to be extinguished. We can also do this by relocating flammable or even combustible materials. And lastly, we have inhibition. Inhibition is usually is stopping the chain reaction of combustion using different chemicals. For example, monoammonium phosphate is used as a dry chemical to extinguish type A, B, and C of a fire. And class, it's important to take note of different classes of fire according to their fuel because each class of fire have their own corresponding fire extinguisher. Okay. We have a pressurized water or aqueous film forming foam fire extinguisher, carbon dioxide fire extinguisher, dry chemical fire extinguisher, halon substitute fire extinguisher, dry powder fire extinguisher, and wet chemical fire extinguisher. And each of the classes of this fire extinguisher have a corresponding class of fire it can extinguish. For example, if there is a class A fire, again, a class A fire is anything that leaves an ash, but creates an ember. Okay? A class A fire can be put out by pressurized water fire extinguisher, dry chemical, and halon substitute fire extinguisher. A class B fire born out of leaks or gas and water, flammable fluids or gas can be put out by 3 fire extinguisher, carbon dioxide fire extinguisher, dry chemical fire extinguisher, and halon substitute fire extinguisher. While a class C of a fire is done by the same types of fire extinguisher. A class D fire, which is a fire born out of metals, of the burning of metal, is actually just extinguished by dry powder type of a fire extinguisher. And when it comes to a class K fire, which is fire born out of cooking materials like cooking oils or cooking fats, can only be extinguished by wet chemical fire extinguisher. And let's talk about these fire extinguishers one by one, starting with pressurized water or AFFF or aqueous film forming foam. Pressurized water fire extinguisher extinguishes fire by taking away the heat, by cooling down the fire itself. Now, when it's an AFFF, the foam agents actually separate oxygen from other elements. By doing this, it not only cools down the fire, but also suffocates the fire. But it can only be used by Class A fire. Why? Because of water. Water can spread flammable liquid in Class B fires. And in Class C fires, aside from you extinguishing the fire, you are at the risk of electrical shock. So AFFF or pressurized water fire extinguisher can only be used on Class A fires. Then we have carbon dioxide fire extinguisher. Carbon dioxide fire extinguisher extinguishes the fire by taking away oxygen. If we blast a fire with carbon dioxide, momentarily, oxygen will be diluted and carbon dioxide will be concentrated at that point. And if that happens, the fire is now extinguished. And because of the cold discharge, it not only suffocates the fire, it also cools it down. Therefore, a carbon dioxide fire extinguisher can be used for Class B and Class C fire. And it's not usually effective for Class A fires. Then we have a dry chemical fire extinguisher. A dry chemical fire extinguisher extinguishes fire primarily by interrupting the chemical reaction. Because it contains certain chemicals, it actually inhibits the chemical reactions. It also works by creating a barrier between oxygen and fuel. It suffocates, it removes fuel, and it inhibits the chemical reaction, which is why the dry chemical fire extinguisher is the most widely used fire extinguisher, because it can actually extinguish a Class A, B, and C fire. Now, there are two types of a dry chemical fire extinguisher. Multi-purpose dry chemical fire extinguisher, which can extinguish A, B, C, and A and B and C, while an ordinary dry chemical fire extinguisher can only extinguish B and C. Then we have halon substitute fire extinguisher. A halon substitute fire extinguisher is halogenated or clean agent. It extinguishes the fire again by interrupting the chemical reaction. There's inhibition. But it also contains halon agents as well as newer and less ozone-depleting halocarbon agents, which makes a halon substitute fire extinguisher much more eco-friendly as compared to a dry chemical fire extinguisher, but it can also extinguish a class A, B, and C of a fire. So if you're looking for a fire extinguisher, let's look at a environmentally more friendly form of a fire extinguisher, which is a halon substitute fire extinguisher. Then we have a dry powder fire extinguisher. A dry powder fire extinguisher, again, extinguishes fire from metals. It is similar to dry chemical, except that they extinguish fire by separating fuel from oxygen or by removing the heat. It can only be used by Class D fires because if we use other forms of fire extinguishers on a Class D fire, the intense temperature of the metal will interact with water and cause water vapor to evaporate and steam to be extruded. And when that happens, that can be very harmful because steam at that point is very high in temperature also. And lastly, we have a wet chemical fire extinguisher. A wet chemical fire extinguisher extinguishes the fire by removing the heat. It does this, it is special because it prevents reignition by creating a barrier between oxygen and fuel elements. And it is used usually in commercial cooking operations. Since it has the capability to prevent a reignition, it is safe to use in a kitchen environment where it's not just one pan that you're looking at. You're looking at other food storages. You're looking at other flammable materials. So in commercial kitchens, they use a Class K fire extinguisher. But sometimes, in kitchens, they also use a wet chemical fire extinguisher on a Class A fire. Now, how exactly do we use a fire extinguisher? I'm hoping that none of you have ever tried using a fire extinguisher. Why? Because you would only use a fire extinguisher when there is an emergency situation. But to understand how to use a fire extinguisher, we must first understand the anatomy of a fire extinguisher. First, we have the main body. It is the painted red body of the fire extinguisher. Then the data plate. The data plate states what type of fire extinguisher this is. Diba? Then we have the carrying handle. This is usually what we hold on to when we transfer and move a fire extinguisher. What's more important here is the pressure gauge. The pressure gauge is a gauge or a meter or a measuring equipment that has three slices. It has a red, green in the middle, and the red slice. And you would notice that there is an arrow. And if that arrow is pointed at the red sides of the gauge, this means that the fire extinguisher is expired. And you'd have to replace that fire extinguisher. But if the arrow is on the green, then it's okay. And class, one tip for you guys is when you want to maintain a fire extinguisher, it is recommended that you shake the fire extinguisher once or twice a month. Okay? This is to ensure that the contents of the fire extinguisher is ready when there is a fire emergency. Then we have the discharge lever. The discharge lever is what we press onto when we want to release the contents of the fire extinguisher. And we can see the safety mechanism of the fire extinguisher. That is the discharge locking pin and seal. What you need to do when you want to use a fire extinguisher is to cut the seal, pull out the pin, and press the discharge lever. That is how you use a fire extinguisher. However, before you do this, you must point the discharge hose, discharge nozzle, and discharge orifice towards the fire itself. BFP has recommended the pass technique when using a fire extinguisher. We can use the password when we are using a fire extinguisher. Pull out the pin of the fire extinguisher. This will allow you to discharge the extinguisher. Aim the nozzle on the base of the fire, not on top of the fire, not on the side of the fire, but on the base of the fire. This is because some fire extinguisher acts as a barrier between the fuel source and the fire itself. And most of the time, the fuel source is at the base of the fire. S, squeeze the handle. Squeeze the top handle or lever to release the contents of the fire extinguisher. And lastly, sweep side to side. Do not go up and down. Instead, sweep from side to side to cover up the fuel as much as you can. And class, it's not enough that you use a fire extinguisher when there is a fire emergency. In fact, the fire extinguisher is just one means for you to save your own life and for you to help save other people when there is a fire emergency. Here are the 6 steps when it comes to a fire emergency. Here is what we need to do when there is a fire emergency. Okay. First, when you see the fire, the first thing that you need to do is sound the alarm. If there is a fire level or a fire alarm near you, press it immediately. Next, advise the fire brigade. After sounding the alarm, call the fire brigade. Call BFP for them to be notified and to send units over to extinguish the flame. Next, if there is a fire extinguisher, use the pass technique and fight the fire using the fire extinguisher. However, if the fire does not immediately extinguish or the fire extinguisher seems to be not working in terms of extinguishing the fire effectively, that is the time to evacuate. When you evacuate calmly. Evacuate relaxed in a relaxed manner and avoid panicking. And at that point, when you have evacuated, tell other people. When it's at your home, inform other people inside the house, inform your neighbors, inform anyone near the vicinity of the fire. And you need to get clear. Remember, class, that our lives are more important than any belongings that we possess. So you need to get clear because it's not just the fire that can incapacitate you, but also the gases, the smoke and carbon monoxide present when there is a fire, as we've talked about before. Now, when it comes to a fire, there are some rules that we need to follow. Okay. Class, never fight a fire if you don't know what's burning. If you don't know what's burning, do not fight the fire. Because the main rule of a fire extinguisher is to cover up the fuel. And if you don't know where the fuel is, then you can't use a fire extinguisher immediately. Don't fight the fire if the fire is spreading rapidly. If the fire is causing you to walk away from the fire, then you should walk away from the fire. Do not fight a fire if you don't have the proper equipment to fight the fire. Do not fight the fire if you might inhale toxic smoke. If the smoke is too thick for you to handle, especially for people who are asthmatic, especially for people who have a pre-existing condition in their respiratory system, do not fight the fire. And lastly, if your instincts tell you to run, run. If your gut feeling tells you to not fight the fire and instead run, you should follow your gut instincts. Remember, class, fire is very dangerous. Yun nga lang paghawak sa kawali na mainit, napapaso na tayo. What more? A big fire bigger than us. It can be very dangerous. Be certain that you will not endanger yourself or others when attempting to pull out a fire. Then let's proceed with fire prevention. Protection is anything that we can do to protect ourselves when there is a fire. But a more important matter to discuss is fire prevention. Fire prevention is the methods and the things that we can do to prevent a fire from going out of control and to prevent and to reduce the fire hazards in our environment. And in fact, class, we have what we call as the Fire Prevention Month. The Fire Prevention Month is on March, and usually drills are held during this month. Hopefully, we can do this in our face-to-face classes, but for now, we can't do this since we are in an online setup. But that Fire Prevention Month is not just a gimmick made by school. No, it's a proclamation by the government. Proclamation number 115A, remember that proclamation, is entitled as the Fire Prevention Month, where it provides the necessary things that we do when there is a Fire Prevention Month. However, it's not just limited to Fire Prevention Month. Yes, the Proclamation 115A is pertaining to Fire Prevention Month. But in 1967, there was a declaration of safety and accident prevention year, where every year there would be an assigned hazard to be prevented and to be notified by the public. For example, in January, it's the general orientation for hazards. For February, it's air transportation hazards. March, again, is fire prevention hazards. April is vacation hazards. May is land transportation hazards. June is sea transportation hazards. July is school hazards. August is farm hazards. September is health and sanitation hazards. October is industry and commerce hazards. November is home hazards, and lastly, December is holiday hazards. So we need to look for these hazards, or we need to have events to prevent these hazards at every month, but we are only going to take note of March as the fire prevention months. In terms of fire prevention, what do? We reduce the fire hazards. How do we do this? We follow these three simple steps. Identify the most likely causes of fire. In your area, kindly look at your area and your environment. Okay? And comment and send a message on what is the most likely causes of fire in your environment. Okay. I'll read those later. I hope that you can see those causes of fire. Now, during the fire prevention steps, aside from identifying the most likely causes of fire, you also need to eliminate or reduce these fire causes. But what exactly are the most common causes of fire in your environment? Well, in the kitchen, here are the following most common causes of fire in the kitchen. The leaking gas stove. It's not the LPG tank that you need to look at. You need to look at the leaks that may happen in the tube from the LPG tank going to the stove. Did you know, class, that LPG tanks contain propane and butane? But it does not actually have a smell. Propane and butane alone do not have a smell. But law mandates that manufacturers of LPG tank include a chemical that would make the smell of LPGs or the gas inside of LPG smell like rotten eggs. Have you ever smelled this? Do you know of the distinct smell of an LPG, of the gas of an LPG? I'm not saying sniff an LPG tank right now, but if you've ever noticed, it smells like rotten eggs. That's because manufacturers intently do this to follow the law. That is another fire prevention method that manufacturers do. Another common cause of a fire is unattended candles or kerosene lamps, or improperly stored combustibles. Class, combustibles are anything that can be lighted. Did you know that dust is combustible? Which is why good housekeeping is another prevention method that we can do. A clean home is a safe home, especially when it comes to a fire. the malfunctioning and overheating of appliances, especially very old appliances, which causes Class C fires. In the bedroom, if you are a smoker, carelessly discarded cigarettes can be very dangerous. Cigarette butts are still lighted fire, which is why this should be disposed properly. And hopefully none of the people in this class are smokers, but if you have anyone who is a smoker inside your home, recommend or say that they should dispose of their cigarette butts properly, because that may cause a fire, especially if everyone is asleep. Again, at the incipient stage of a fire, we can't detect it and will only be waking up to a huge fire inside our homes. And in the bedroom, there's also the overheating of appliances. Oh, especially appliances like an iron that is designed to keep heated, or an air conditioner which produces a lot of heat. In the living room, it's the same with the overheating appliances, but it's an added feature of combustible furniture. Some furniture are highly combustible, especially wooden furniture, which is why this is the most common cause of a fire in a living room. But for all rooms, this is what we need to look for: the storage of combustible materials. Is the dust thick in your closet, or on the top of your drawers, or on the top of your cabinets? It's a good practice to clean those because that is very combustible. Electrical wirings or overloaded circuits. Class, do you know what a octopus plug-in outlet is? An octopus plug-in outlet is, for example, you have an outlet, and then there's an attached extension to that outlet. And on that extension, there's an attached another one of an extension. And there in that extension, there's an attached another one of an extension. And on that extension, there's an attached, let's say, your laptop charging. That is what we call as an octopus plug-in. Why? Because like an octopus, there might be another appliance plugged in here. For example, a fan. Forgive by fan, it's very hard to draw using a mouse. Or for example, here there's a plugged-in kettle. Forgive my kettle again. Smoke yan. Okay. This is an octopus connection. Why is this dangerous? Because each of this connection multiplies the factor of fire hazards. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So fire hazard in this case is multiplied by 6, making the risk of a fire developing higher and higher, which is why you should avoid this type of connections, especially when you are going to sleep, where you can't detect the incipient stage of a fire. In all rooms also, combustible furniture, fixtures, curtains, and waste baskets are also the common cause of a fire. However, when it comes to the causes of fire, accidental causes are usually what is the culprit of the start of a fire. That is feeling of highly flammable liquids, like for example, gas canisters, which may leak, diba? Matches and lighters that are left unchecked, exploding firecrackers. Has anyone ever tried using a piccolo or a boga or a goodbye Philippines or goodbye world? Be sure that when you are using firecrackers, that you are being responsible enough to not throw it at other people. Okay? Huwag na kayong mangdamay. Or to not throw it inside the house, because this may cause a fire. Furthermore, this may cause damages to our own body. Okay. Candles and kerosene that are left unchecked, and leaky LPG gas tanks and hoses. These are the most common causes of fires. Now, for fire preparedness, what do we need to do? The first thing that we need to do is to develop and practice an escape plan. In your homes, do you have an escape plan? If you don't, maybe now's the time to develop that escape plan. Where do you need to escape? If there's a fire that exists in the kitchen, where do you go? If a fire exists or starts in the bedroom, where do you go? As this is important, especially in people living in high-rise apartments, to know the building's evacuation plan. Where are the fire extinguishers in your home? Where are the fire extinguishers in the building? You should know this to prepare yourselves of a fire emergency. Install smoke detectors ideally on every level of the house. Then, if there are smoke detectors, test the smoke detectors. It has a test button that would release the sound and make sure to replace the battery. It's important to keep a fire extinguisher near areas where there might be a fire, like the furnace, garage, or anywhere else that a fire may start. However, do not place it near a fire itself. Because if there's an emergency fire and you placed an extinguisher right next to the fire, you can't get the extinguisher anymore. Nonsense. They place the phone numbers of the nearest fire station right beside your phone, or better yet, you can post it or you can post it on the wall or on your refrigerator to prevent a emergency, or to help yourself to prepare yourself when there is a fire emergency. Furthermore, keep cooking areas free from flammable objects such as pot holders, towels, and curtains. All of my pot holders were replaced because they were burned in a stove, which makes me think that a stove is very dangerous when there is flammable materials near it. Keep children out of the kitchen when you are cooking. And lastly, always stay with the stove when you are cooking. And turn it off when you walk away. Furthermore, when it comes to what we do when there is to prepare ourselves for a fire, we need to eliminate combustible materials by performing good housekeeping. A clean home is a safe home, especially for fire hazards. Keep flammable items like fabric and paper away from candles. Store gasoline, newspaper, and other combustible away from sources of flames. It is important that you place them on the lower part of the shelves. Why? Because hot air goes up. And if that hot air comes into contact with gasoline and other combustibles, it may spread the fire. Keep space heaters, even if we don't have space heaters in the Philippines, at least I think so, on a level surface away from fabric and flammable items. Keep matches out of children's reach. And lastly, if you're using candles or kerosene lamp, put out the flame before going to bed. If you're fond of scented candles, you need to blow that out before you sleep. Furthermore, we should schedule regular inspection of electrical wiring, cooking equipment, and electrical appliances, especially air conditioning units. Switch off and unplug unused electrical appliances, especially when you are going to bed, and participate in fire education seminars and fire drills. What are the don'ts when it comes to fire preparedness? First, do not put a fire extinguisher behind a door or too close to a potential source of fire. If you put it in an area where you can't access it directly, then it's not functional. Never disable or remove the battery of your smoke alarm if you have them. Never leave food on the stove or on the oven unattended. Okay, this may start the fire. Burning candles should never be left unattended. Do not overload electrical circuits by using additional light and electrical appliances. Never leave a warm or hot flat iron unattended. Blown fuses should not be replaced by wire or any metals. Fuses are there for a fail-safe method to prevent the overloading of appliances. And if you replace it with a wire or a metal, that causes furthermore a fire to happen. And don't smoke in bed or when you're drowsy. Fire preparedness is indeed an important thing that we need to do, which is why we have the regular fire drills. Okay? Fire drills is an exercise or practice that teaches people on how to leave the building safely. It is important to attend fire drills, which I am sure that you have experienced at least once in your high school days or even in your elementary days, diba? Because the purpose of a fire drill is to ensure the efficient and safe exit of people. to know where to go and what to do when there is a fire, to help prevent a panic when there is a fire, to prevent people from panicking because people know where to go. And if people are not ignorant, they will not panic. Diba? The occupants that will participate in a drill will learn to locate the fire exits of a building, to leave the building in the house in smooth, orderly, and disciplined manner, to recognize the sound of the fire alarm system, and to assemble at a designated evacuation area. I am hoping that in your face-to-face classes, we experience a fire drill and we experience what to do when there is a fire in our school and in our own homes. And when there is a fire drill, we need to follow these don'ts. Don't panic when there is a fire drill. I remember there was a fire drill back in my college when I was studying, and because there was a drill, some people fainted. They were not chill. It caused an anxiety attack for themselves, therefore they panicked. Okay? Don't return for your personal belongings yet. Go back for them after the drill. Do not use the elevator because the elevator might be compromised. Do not hide in comfort rooms because you're trapped inside a comfort room. Even if you think that there's water in a comfort room and you can be safe in a comfort room because there's water, smoke is not extinguished by water. So you might be smoked out of the restroom or of the comfort room. Don't run, but don't lag behind. Walk in an orderly manner. Don't cause confusion. Don't announce anything that you are not sure of. Don't scream or make unnecessary noises. And lastly, don't laugh. And treat exit drills as a joke. Okay? So these are the don'ts when there is a fire drill. And the Bureau of Fire Protection actually provided and given us an infographic or what we can do when there is a fire. So make sure that you study this to know the past technique, to know what to do in case of a fire, and to know what to do to prevent a fire from happening. And with that said, class, that concludes our lesson in fire hazards. Okay? If you have any questions, you are free to ask them in our MSTeams class. Goodbye, class, and thank you for listening. I really hope that you learned something today, and I hope that we can apply this in our lives for the safety of ourselves and our loved ones. With that said, you may now exit this video, and goodbye and thank you, class.